This episode of True Crime Conversations contains discussions of violence. Listener discretion is advised. It was the last day of spring, 1948, when John Lyons and his wife found themselves strolling along Somerton Beach in South Australia. The sun was setting and it was quiet. The breeze cooled their bare skin and they watched as the water rhythmically advanced and retreated. As they slowly walked along the beach, they began to make out an unusual shape. Something that looked like it didn't belong. It was the mosquitoes that first caught their attention. They were buzzing around a man who appeared to be slouching against the seawall. His body was flat, while his head was propped up awkwardly. It was strange, they thought, that he seemed so unbothered by the insects. John decided to check on him, but as he approached, the man raised his arm. He was okay, he seemed to indicate. The man didn't appear homeless or like he'd been the subject of a violent attack. He was well dressed and good looking. Perhaps he'd drunk too much, the passers-by assumed. The couple would later realise that they were some of the last people to see that man alive. A man who more than 70 years later, no one even knows the name of. He would come to be known as the Somerton Man, and has since become the subject of one of the most baffling mysteries in human history. I'm Jessie Stevens and this is True Crime Conversations, exploring the world's most notorious crimes by speaking to the people who know the most about them. In this episode, I'm speaking with Fiona Ellis-Jones about the case of the Somerton Man. Fiona is a journalist and presenter with the ABC, Australia's leading public broadcaster, and the host of the Somerton Man Mystery by ABC Radio National. The Somerton Man will also appear on Monday night's episode of Australian Story. It was the 1st of December 1948 when a man was found dead on Somerton Beach. Can you describe the scene?
Well, it was the first day of summer, so think Adelaide, it's quite warm. It was very early in the morning. It was just after 6 a.m. And there were a couple of local jockeys because back in the day, Somerton, Bright and Glenelg beaches used to be quite popular for horse races. So there were two jockeys, one by the name of Neil Day, who was travelling down the beach, and they saw this man and they thought, that's a little strange. He's wearing a suit and he's quite well dressed and he's not moving. And they kept going with their ride, and then on their way back they saw that he was still there. And by this time another local man had kind of gone over to see what was happening as well, and they worked out pretty quickly that this guy was dead. And they phoned the local police, and the police initially assumed that this was just a suicide. But as they started digging deeper, there were so many things that didn't make sense about this guy's death.
What were, sort of immediately they didn't recognise the man. He wasn't someone who had been, had been found to be missing. What were the defining features about his body? How would you describe the man?
He was quite striking. He was a good-looking guy. Like I said, he was really well-dressed. He was middle-aged. He had a little bit of salt and pepper on the sides of his hair. His fingernails were clean. He had no calluses on his hands, so immediately they thought, well, this guy is not a tradie. He's not a labourer. He's not working on the ships. He is a professional guy. His shoes were absolutely immaculate, not a speck of dirt or sand, as you would expect if he had been walking on the beach. His clothes are completely dry, so he certainly hadn't washed ashore. And they noticed a couple of abnormalities. For example, his toes that was discovered at a subsequent autopsy were oddly wedged-shaped. He was missing a whole lot of teeth, and he had absolutely no identification on him, no wallet. But that wasn't the only creepy thing. All of the tags on his clothes had been cut off.
Was that usual at the time? That seems really bizarre. Are you talking about like the actual clothing tags that say the
clothing
size?
Tags, yeah. Well, it was odd. A lot of people with rationing after the war, they would recycle clothes and they would use a lot of clothes and wear hand-me-downs. But to have all the labels cut off, police thought were very strange. They kind of waited and they did a lot of publicity locally because they thought someone's got to claim this guy, but nobody came forward.
And was it obvious when they sort of did that initial autopsy to try and work out who this guy was and what happened to him, what his cause of death was?
Well, no, and we still don't know. It was inconclusive. They assumed at the time that it was some kind of poison because he had no abrasions on his body. He had no cuts or bruises, and it didn't look like he had died naturally or unnaturally. They were just totally stumped. The only kind of striking things that the coroner found, that the examiner found and the coroner concluded, was that he had a strikingly enlarged spleen, which was odd. And it looked like potentially the cause of death had been heart failure. But in terms of what brought on that death, there was absolutely no indication. So they put it down to some kind of poison that was undetectable at the time in 1948, 1949 to science.
And were there any known last sightings of him on that beach or in the surrounding areas?
There is a bit of controversy about this. A case of this magnitude attracts a lot of, I don't want to say conspiracies, but there is a lot of different thoughts on when he was last seen. But it's generally confirmed by most experts that he was seen in that exact position the night before his body was found. And a couple were walking along Somerton Beach, which is, a quiet stretch of beach, really. It's not like neighbouring Glenelg, which has a lot of foot traffic. But it was a nice evening, and a couple reported seeing the man the night before, and he waved his arm into the air and then slumped it back down. And they just assumed that this guy was a local drunk. But then, ironically, one of the people who saw him the night before was also on the scene the next morning and went, that's weird. And there were a couple of other things that night. For example, the couple reported that there were mosquitoes all around his body, and they thought, that's strange. This guy must be so out of it to not realise that he's getting massacred by mosquitoes.
Can you tell us about the suitcase that had been checked into Adelaide railway station?
Yes, so this was the first major breakthrough for local coppers in Adelaide, and you can imagine that they would have been absolutely overwhelmed by the enormity of this case when nobody came forward. And they found this suitcase and they immediately were able to link it back to this man because all of the clothes in the suitcase also had their labels cut off. And there was also this tiny bit of waxed thread in the suitcase, and they were able to match that to the guy's suit. It looked like he'd done a bit of a repair job on his pants, and he'd used this very specific wax thread, which incidentally wasn't available in Australia at the time. It was an American thread. So that did raise a lot of questions that perhaps this guy was a traveller. But there was no identification in that suitcase either. There were a few random things on his possession and in that suitcase. For example, on the body they found a second-class ticket from Adelaide to nearby Henley Beach. They found an unused bus ticket as well, an aluminium comb, which was only also available in America, and they found some juicy fruit chewing gum, which wasn't readily available at the time in Australia, again suggesting he might have been American. But when I first heard about the case, one of the weirdest things to me is that he had a packet of Army Club cigarettes, but inside the cigarettes were smokes from a different brand called Kensitas. And the thing is that the Army Club cigarettes were the cheaper brand, and this guy carried around expensive cigarettes. So you'd think it would be the other way around if you were trying to fob yourself off as being, of a higher class. So this raised a lot of suspicion, the contents both in that suitcase at Adelaide railway station and the contents on his possession.
And he had a cigarette in his pocket, didn't he?
On his lapel. He had a cigarette sitting on his lapel. Interestingly, the initial search of the body, they didn't find a packet of matches, although during the autopsy they later discovered a packet of matches. So that was kind of raising a bit of scepticism as well.
So would you say that with that evidence, obviously he doesn't have a wallet or anything on him, and then there's a suitcase that doesn't have a name on it, did it appear that this was a man who didn't want people to know his true identity?
Potentially, yes. And things took an even weirder turn when they actually did an autopsy of the man's body. And during that, they did a second search of his clothes. And the examiner found deep within a fob pocket, which is kind of, that kind of coin pocket that you have in your jeans or your pants. Deep within there, they found something. And it was rolled up so tightly, it appeared to be a little piece of paper. And the guy said, in a later recording, he said that he had to pull it out with tweezers. It was so deep inside that fob pocket. And they unravelled this little piece of paper and it had the words "Tamam Shud." So you could imagine by this stage, the detectives, the reporters, everyone in Adelaide is just going, what does this mean? It means the end, essentially, in Persian, in Farsi. So this just added a whole new dynamic to the case, which was by this stage starting to get quite a bit of traction, not just in Adelaide, but also in Australia. And the cops put out this search for where these words came from. And it was a local journo with the Adelaide Advertiser who said, hey, if you look to the back page of this obscure book of Persian poetry called the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, you will find those final words, Tamam Shud, meaning the end or it is finished. So then the search starts for this book, missing its final words.
And so did the police put a word out to say we are looking for this very specific book?
They did put a word out and they eventually find the book, but they didn't have any success in identifying the guy. So initially, before the Tamam Shud piece of paper, they put photos of autopsy, mortuary photos of the guy and spread them throughout Adelaide, throughout the world, and they found nothing. They sent his fingerprints off, even to the FBI, Scotland Yard. No one had any record of who this guy was. There were a lot of people in Adelaide who came to the Adelaide Museum where his body was and said, you know, I think this is my long-lost son, this is my dad, potential husband, but no one could match it up. And the case, until the discovery of the Tamam Shud words, was really kind of at a wall. It wasn't until they found that piece of paper that somebody came forward and said, hey, I think I've got that book and it's missing the final page. Those little words have been torn. It was just a small book, like a pocket book. And the cop said, oh, yeah, okay, well, we want to talk to you. Come to the station. And he said, well, I was actually parked near Somerton Beach that day, so the last day of November. And he's like, look, I had all my windows down, which wasn't unusual back, 1948. And I reckon someone has tossed it in. And they said, well, this is 6 months later. Why haven't you come forward before? And he said, well, I kind of thought it was my brother-in-law's book. He kind of thought it was mine. Weird, but believable, potentially.
You wouldn't go to the police if you found a strange book in your
car.
car.
No, I mean, people have, all sorts of stuff in their car.
Yeah.
So anyway, they matched that piece of paper to this book. They did all this forensic testing. They worked out it was exactly the piece of paper. So the assumption being that this guy was walking towards Somerton Beach, threw the book into the car and then ended up dying on that beach. By this stage, the general thought was, well, this is suicide. This is a suicide letter and this is a tragic death by his own hand on Somerton Beach.
And then when they had a look at that book more closely, a number of other bizarre clues started to present themselves. What else did that book hold?
Correct. It had 2 phone numbers. One was for a local bank. The other was for a local nurse by the name of Jo Thompson. Jo Thompson automatically became obviously a person that the cops wanted to speak to. They tracked her down. They knocked on her door, which incidentally was about 500 metres or so from where the Somerton Man was found. Like it's literally a 2 or 3 minute walk. And they knocked on the door and they showed Jo Thompson this photo. And they said, do you know this guy? And she said, no. I've never seen him before. And they said, look, can we take you down to the Adelaide Museum? Because by this stage, the body had begun to deteriorate. So they'd made like a plaster cast of the man's body. And they said, can we take you down here and show you this plaster cast? And the guy who made the plaster cast bust, a taxidermist by the name of Paul Lawson, later described her seeing this bust, denying that she knew him, but looking so physically shaken that he thought she was going to faint. But still she maintained, no, I don't know who this guy is.
And there was a message, or what seemed to be a message in there, wasn't there? Like they could make out some letters?
There was the indentation of what appeared to be some kind of code. So it was this string of 4 or 5 lines long, like a long nonsensical string of letters. And police couldn't at the time make sense of what that alleged code was. In fact, no one has ever been able to crack that code. We've had experts from around the world who have dedicated so many hours to try and crack the so-called code. Most, and especially one who we'll hear from a bit later, seems to just be of the belief now that maybe it wasn't a code. It was some kind of aide de memoire or the first kind of few letters of a shopping list. But they have had some pretty significant minds and some pretty significant computers in the last few decades try and crack that code. But to no avail.
And did this woman, this nurse, have any connection to that book?
Well, this is where things, I don't want to say start to get weirder, but they take another turn entirely. Because when the cops worked out they weren't going to get anywhere with Jo Thompson, who also goes by the name of Jestin, that was her nickname, when they worked out she was not going to budge on whether or not she knew this guy, they kind of changed tack a bit and they said, well, okay, let's just put it this way. Have you ever seen a copy of this book? And they showed her the Rubaiyat and she said, yes, I have seen that. And she said, I'm a fan of Omar Khayyam's poetry. I love that book. And they thought, okay, right, sweet, we're on to something. Have you ever given this book to somebody? And she said, yep, I've given it to a guy by the name of Alf Boxall, exactly that book. And I inscribed it inside. And they said, okay, Alf Boxall, where do we find him? So Alf Boxall was a Sydney Army lieutenant. And Jo Thompson said she'd met him in Sydney a few years earlier when he was working for the Army at a place called Clifton Gardens, Charter Bay, which is kind of near Taronga Zoo, near Mossman on Sydney's lower North Shore. And they thought, right, that's it, we've cracked it. The guy on the beach must be Alf Boxall. But the only problem was Alf Boxall was still alive in Sydney and they tracked him down and he produced this copy of the Rubaiyat that was intact. It was signed by Jestin and it still had those final words, Tamam Shud, in the back.
And was she a woman who was married? Did she have a family?
She did. She, I don't believe, was married at the time. She later married somebody by the name of George Thompson or Prosper Thompson, and she had a little boy. And this little boy was born about 18 months before the man appeared on Somerton Beach. And for all intents and purposes, he was raised as George's son. But we've spoken to a number of friends of Jo Thompson who has since deceased, and they have said that she confided that George was not the father of this little boy, whose name was Robin Thompson. And Robin Thompson shared a number of rare genetic traits with the Somerton Man.
What were those rare genetic traits?
So you might remember I said the Somerton Man was missing quite a few teeth, which wasn't really unusual in 1948. But he also had this strange condition, a very rare condition called hypodontia, and that is where his lateral incisor teeth were missing. And he had those kind of sharper teeth right next to his front teeth. And this is quite a rare issue in dentistry, and it's a highly heritable genetic condition. And Robin Thompson also had these teeth. Add to that, Robin Thompson became a dancer, an extremely accomplished ballet dancer with the Royal Australian Ballet and the New Zealand Ballet. And there was a line of thinking that because the Somerton Man had those wedged feet and these extremely highly developed calf muscles, that perhaps he was a travelling ballet dancer as well.
And was there something about ears?
Yes. So the ears of the Somerton Man were quite distinct, and it wasn't until a professor later in the last 10 years was looking at the photos, and this professor's name is Derek Abbott, and he is a professor of engineering, electrical engineering and cryptography at the University of Adelaide, and he is considered the foremost expert on this Somerton Man case. And Professor Abbott's line of thought when he came across Robin Thompson was, this has to be the son of the Somerton Man. By this stage, Robin Thompson had died too. He only died 2 years later after his mum. But he was looking at the photo of Robin Thompson and he was looking at the photo of the Somerton Man, and he just describes it as it's springing out at him. He noticed that the proportions of the inner ear on the Somerton Man were a little bit odd. Where we would normally have a larger Simba, his was the other way around. And that too is a highly genetic condition, and Professor Abbott described that feeling where he saw that Robin Thompson also had that. So he took these two photos to an anatomist at the Adelaide University by the name of Professor Marche Henneberg, and he said, look, do these kind of ears look weird to you? Do these teeth look weird to you? And the professor said, yes, they are weird, and he described the hypodontia of the teeth and the ears, and he said that is a highly genetic feature, and he said that it is highly likely that this is the son of the Somerton Man.
And you're saying that those conditions are rare. When they looked at the man who was meant to be his father, did he possess any of those traits?
No, there is definitely not the same genetic resemblance between Prosper Thompson and the Somerton Man as there is with Robin. I mean, Robin also had a lot of really obvious defining genetic characteristics with his mother, Jo Thompson, as well. You can see that the nose is clearly from Jo. But there is something eerie about seeing the photos up close of Robin and the Somerton Man. There is clearly a very strong genetic link.
Can you talk us through the sort of historical context? Because we're talking about the late 1940s, so we're going post-World War II. What was happening at the time that might have been relevant to this case?
Well, there was a lot of paranoia, obviously, after the end of World War II. And there was a lot of fears, particularly of, Reds under the beds and Cold War paranoia. And there was a lot of fear about refugees, especially those from Russia and Eastern Europe, of which there was a large program underway, obviously an assisted migration scheme in Australia. So there was a lot of sensitivity. There was a heightened feeling of the unknown, especially in Adelaide, because Adelaide is a key area in terms of military installments. You've got Woomera in the north of South Australia, not too far away. So Adelaide was kind of a hub of intelligence and of spy activity and espionage. So that was certainly, I think, playing into the fears of Australians at that time. Obviously, having a guy on a beach with no clothing, no labels, and an association to a foreign book potentially containing a code, there were a lot of theories about who this guy was. I mentioned Alf Boxall before, who was working in defence. Interestingly, he did an interview with the ABC in the 70s, and he was quizzed about what his role was with the Australian Defence Force. And it turns out that he was working in intelligence. At that site where he met Jo Thompson that I mentioned in Chowder Bay, Clifton Gardens, that was a hub of intelligence. In fact, there is a particular area called the Old Fort around Middle Head, and that was where the Australian Army Intelligence Agency was based, and that is a precursor to ASIO. So there were a lot of questions about the role of Alf Boxall in all of this. Was he a spy? Was Jo Thompson a spy? Was the Somerton Man also a spy?
Is there evidence looking back that there was spy activity around that time?
Most definitely.
Okay.
Absolutely. And most of the historians that we've spoken to have said, yes, 100%. And the main source of which would have been Russian spies as well.
And that would have been an enormous fear at the time because of the influence of communism and Australia wanting to push that out.
Absolutely. So that played a huge role in the initial stages of the inquiry. And there are many people who believe to this day that the Somerton Man was a Russian spy. But kind of, for me, that doesn't answer too many questions, especially when you look at the evidence that he was the father of Robin Thompson. To me, and I went into this story thinking he's got to be a spy. There are just too many links here. But to me, an affair of the heart makes a lot more sense. I mean, what was he doing in Adelaide? He was obviously a stranger. There were so many indications that he was a stranger. But why was he trying to see Jo Thompson? Did he know he was sick? Was he going to die a natural death on the beach? And that explains the enlarged spleen and the lack of any kind of physical damage to his body, any violence. Or was it a death by force by Jo Thompson?
But then it's bizarre because she denied knowing him, which then sort of lends itself to the theory that was she also a spy and therefore couldn't be connected to him in any way?
Yeah. We spoke to a lot of people who knew Jo Thompson and they described her as incredibly cagey. She would often just pick up and move, and that coincided a lot of the time when the Somerton Man case started getting traction or renewed attention in the media. Jo would just pick up and she would move. And a lot of people also said that she was hard to kind of get a handle on. I know her daughter, Kate, in an interview with 60 Minutes, described her mum as somebody who spoke Russian. She never knew her mum spoke Russian, but she overheard her once apparently speaking Russian. So she certainly doesn't discount the theory that her mother was involved in some kind of spy activity.
And when interviewed on that 60 Minutes episode, she suggested that she did know the Somerton Man, didn't she? Like her mother, she gave some sort of insight into what their relationship might have been.
Yes, I don't think that there is any doubt at all that Jo Thompson knew who the Somerton Man was. And I don't think there was any doubt at all that he wanted Joe Thompson to be found, because the way he disposed of that rubaiyat with her phone number inside was so incredibly deliberate. It was almost as if he wanted somebody to kind of go through his steps and put all these missing pieces together.
The other question, therefore, has to be DNA. If they have a theory about who his son might be, why hasn't there been any sort of DNA testing?
Well, there has been a little bit. So a couple of years ago, Professor Abbott, who I mentioned, who made that first link between Robin and the Somerton Man, he has been so committed to this case, and he has been pretty close to cracking it. So to kind of go back a couple of steps from the DNA, when he found out that both Joe and Robin had died, he went, well, is there any other living relative? And he thought, I wonder if Robin had any children. And he found out that Robin did. He had a daughter by the name of Rachel. And Rachel was actually adopted out by Robin and his then partner Roma. And she too was a ballet dancer with the New Zealand Ballet. And Rachel was adopted out in New Zealand. We've spent a lot of time together, and she's described growing up in New Zealand as kind of not feeling like she fit in with her family and always feeling like there was something more to life. And it wasn't until she found out later in life that she was adopted that she said it all made a lot of sense to her. And she ended up finding her biological mother, Roma, and Roma lived in Brisbane at the time. She'd separated from Robin. And Roma and her became quite close, and she said, come live with me in Brisbane. So Rachel picked up from Christchurch, where she was living, and moved to Brisbane. And it was around this time that they received a letter from Professor Abbott. And this letter said words to the effect of, it was to Roma, I'd like to talk to you about this case. There was a clipping of the Somerton Man, and he suggested that perhaps Robin might have been the Somerton Man's son. He didn't actually even use the word Robin. He just said somebody who you've danced with in the past. And Rachel describes Roma as saying straight away, this has got to be Robin. And this nurse referred to in this newspaper article, this is your grandma, Granny Jo. And Rachel says she was really sceptical at the time, and she thought this was just a crazy, fanciful, story invented by the professor. But she said, okay, let's meet with him and let's see what he wants and what evidence he has to back this up. And they met and they went out to dinner, and within 24 hours, Rachel and Professor Derek Abbott were engaged to be married.
That is so weird.
It's weird. But you know what? 10 years on and they're still married, and they've got 3 beautiful little kids. And Rachel is absolutely as dedicated to Derek as finding closure to this case. Needless to say, there was a lot that was said at the time and a lot that has been said since about Derek and Rachel and about the reasons that they fell in love so quickly. And, if I can be so harsh as to say, did Derek marry her for her DNA? And Rachel thinks that that's, hilarious, as does Derek. And she said, well, look, I would have given it up willingly. You didn't have to marry me for that. But in kind of answer to your question, and that was the long way of getting to it, yes, Derek has utilised Rachel's DNA, in effect trying to find out a link to the Somerton Man. Unfortunately, that hasn't been incredibly conclusive, so he's put her DNA on forensic genealogy sites, and he has found quite a lot of unexplained relatives, so relatives that can't be explained through Roma's line, and they all live in America. So that is kind of weird and kind of telling, but they're so far removed. They're like 5 or 6 cousins. So in terms of finding a name and the immediate family of the Somerton Man, that's not helped. But a couple of years ago, Professor Abbott managed to get a couple of hairs from that plaster cast bust that they made, and he had them tested in his lab, but unfortunately they just weren't strong enough to yield any kind of information, specific information as to the Somerton Man's DNA. And most of the experts are in agreement that the only way to get this information is to exhume the body of the Somerton Man and test multiple different parts of his body, i.e. his hair and his bones, to see if DNA can be extracted, and then that DNA can be uploaded to forensic genealogical websites and a direct match to his family made, and also obviously provide a name and some kind of closure to those involved in the case.
And how likely do you think that is?
I think it is increasingly likely, Professor Abbott has made 2 requests to the South Australian Attorney General to have the body of the Somerton Man exhumed, and both of those applications were denied on the grounds that public interest, public curiosity had not been reached, and that didn't go more, broadly ahead of scientific research. However, we spoke to the current South Australian Attorney General for this series. Her name is Vicky Chapman. The decisions not to exhume were under the former Attorney General John Rao. And Vicky Chapman said to us, yeah, I'm open to this. And she granted approval to have him exhumed, provided that taxpayers don't pay for any of it. Derek Abbott reckons it'll cost about $20,000 to have the Somerton Man exhumed and all the forensic testing and supervision done, and then have his body buried again.
And why do you think the answer matters so much? You say that there's a number of people involved, and obviously there's an enormous amount of curiosity. What do you think it will mean to know who the Somerton Man really is?
Well, for Rachel and Derek, they've described it as so important, not only for closure for Rachel, but also for their children to know who their mum's biological grandfather is. And it's important to know, even if we do get his DNA and we do find out even a name, then that's still not the end of the story, because we need the backstory then. We need to find out what brought him to Adelaide in the first place. But it is definitely the closest opportunity that we have, and the most likely that will yield answers to some of those questions that have endured for, over 70 years. And like I said, sparked so many different conspiracy theories. I mean, this story is ranked, in the top 10 of unsolved cold cases in the world consistently. It's one of the most baffling cases, definitely the most baffling case that I've ever come across. And it has, almost like a cult following. So I think for a public resolution, but for mainly resolution for Derek Abbott and Rachel Egan.
And do you think that's why it has endured? Because as you say, it was, more than 70 years ago. It's a case of a man that we couldn't identify at the time and still can't. Why do you think it is that there is such enduring fascination and interest in this case?
I think because it is like a rabbit warren. Like when I first came to this case, I was intrigued by it. I've been fascinated with it for the last 20 years. I remember as a little kid, my dad going, "Oh, look at this copy of the Rubaiyat." And I was like, "What is that, Dad? That is so weird." And then I guess sensing that I wasn't interested in the book, he was like, "Oh, it's got this really awesome backstory," and told me all about the Somerton Man. I was so hooked, and I've followed it really, really closely throughout my working career as a journalist. Every time, that Professor Abbott would make another bid for an exhumation, or he found a little bit of DNA that could potentially solve it, I was always so fascinated in it. But I think it is mainly because it is just such a complex story. And then you obviously add in the spy angle, and you add in potential, lover, or why he was found on that beach. And then you add in this contemporary, dare I say, double love story with Rachel and Derek. It just takes the case to a whole level of weirdness.
Are you able to tell us what you think in your guts, after having studied it for so long, what you think the answer is?
Oh, that's a really hard question. I think that it was an affair of the heart, and I think in all likelihood it was a tragic suicide, that Joe Thompson and the Somerton Man had met near Mossman, and that they had had an affair, and she had got pregnant, and she had then moved to Adelaide, cut off communication. Whether or not he was sick and he was going to say his farewells to a love lost and a child lost, or whether he did take his own life, I think that the Tamam Shud was, that was a pretty ingenious way to continue his legacy and discussion after he died. And the fact that he left so many clues and so many unanswered questions, I feel like I said earlier, he wanted this case to be solved, and he wanted Joe Thompson to be found, and he wanted questions to be asked about his death. But I think in all likelihood this was just, a tragic World War II dalliance that had ended in a suicide on the beach.
And in that case, why do you think that she never admitted to knowing him? Do you think it was because of the new relationship?
I think it was probably to protect that relationship, her new marriage, and it was also to protect her son. I mean, it was a very different time, the late 40s and the early 50s in Australia. to have a young single woman get pregnant. I mean, she was a nursing student. She never actually finished her studies here at the Royal North Shore Hospital in Sydney. It was a completely different era. But I think the reason fundamentally that so many mysteries, have continued to linger about this case is because there's just so much that is unknown. I mean, in research for this case, for example, something that we discovered was that there were other deaths that were linked to the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, and these were never publicly linked. For example, one death in particular that really struck at us was a guy by the name of George Marshall, and he was found just around the corner from Chowder Bay Clifton Gardens a few years earlier on a bush track, and this is literally just near Athol Bay, which is pretty close to Taronga Zoo, so not far from Clifton Gardens, about 5 minutes walk through a bush track. And he was found dead with a couple of pill bottles beside him, and on his chest was an open copy of the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam.
Is there anything in that book that is giving us some clue as to why it might connect these deaths?
Not really. I mean, I've read the book pretty closely. I have a copy here. I can show you, Jessie. But it's been described to me by academics as a book of Persian love poetry. Although a lot of the readings in it are quite sombre, while it's hard because it's poetry, it's not explicit, but it does seem to touch a lot on the afterlife, potentially suicide. But it was generally considered at the time as a book given between young lovers.
And wasn't there a woman who came forward years later with an ID card of some sort?
Yes. So this is quite bizarre, if you didn't think the rest of it was bizarre. A woman wrote into Professor Henneberg, who is the guy who did that. He's a biological anthropologist who did those facial comparisons between Robin Thompson and the Somerton Man. And she said, look, I've just been going through my dad's old possessions. He's just died. And I found this random ID card in among all the family photo albums and possessions. And I can't pick this guy. I have no idea who he is. And it seems really out of place. And she said, I'm wondering, is this guy the Somerton Man? He looks kind of like a young Somerton Man. And if you look at the picture, he really does. And Professor Marche Henneberg said, sure, send me the card, I'll have a look at it, I'll do some modelling. And he said that, he thinks this guy is a Somerton Man. On the card, it says the name is H.C. Reynolds, and it says he was born in 1900 and his occupation is listed as British. It's like a kind of card that was issued to foreign seamen at the time.
And how about the ears and those sort of genetic markers?
It's hard to see because the picture's black and white. It's obviously from so long ago. But the ears seem to be there. And not only that, there's this facial mole on his cheek that is in an identical position and exactly the same size as a mole that the Somerton Man had on his face. So this obviously raises so many questions as to why her dad, who we should say she was long estranged from, so she couldn't ask him, and he'd just died, had this ID card. We know that her dad spent a lot of time around Somerton. They were local to the area. So it does make sense. A lot of the experts are very sceptical about this, Professor Abbott especially, and also the former cold case investigator on the case, Jerry Feltus. They don't believe that H.C. Reynolds was the Somerton Man. I did a fair bit of research on this guy, and I tracked down one H.C. Reynolds who did serve a few years on a ship in New Zealand, and he was born in the same time period. His name was Horace Charles. Potentially, it could be the same person, but this particular Horace Charles died in Tasmania in the 50s, so it doesn't add up unless there is another H.C. Reynolds who was born exactly the same time period, but I haven't been able to track that down. So if anybody out there can work it out, then that would be fantastic.
That's so interesting, isn't it? Thank you so much for speaking to us today. I can't wait to continue listening to the podcast. It is fascinating, and for all your hard work on the case.
Thank you very much, Jessie.
You can watch Fiona Ellis-Jones's report on the Somerton Man on ABC's Australian Story program, airing on Monday, October the 14th. You can also subscribe to the ABC's Somerton Man Mystery Podcast by searching Radio National Presents in your podcast feed. For photos, maps and extra reading on the Somerton Man, don't forget to join our closed Facebook group. Just search True Crime Conversations on Facebook. You can also contact the show by emailing truecrime@mamamia.com.au. True Crime Conversations is a Mamma Mia podcast hosted by me, Jessie Stevens, and produced by Elise Cooper.